December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air smells of burning oil and salt water. Sirens wail through the harbor as black smoke coils into the bright Pacific sky. Metal screams. Sailors run across blistering decks as explosions punch through steel hulls. Machine gun fire rattles across the water. A battleship rolls slowly, helplessly, into the harbor mud. The shock is physical. It hits like a hammer across the Pacific. On the American mainland, church bells are still ringing for Sunday service. Factory whistles are silent. Assembly lines stand calm. Workers sip coffee. They have no idea that within hours, everything they know will change. By the next afternoon, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stands before Congress and calls it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declares war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. America is fully inside World War II, but America's real weapon is not yet on a battlefield. It is inside its factories. Before the war, the United States is still climbing out of the Great Depression. Unemployment had been high. Industrial capacity existed, but it was underused. Car plants in Detroit built sedans and pickup trucks. Steel mills rolled beams for skyscrapers. Shipyards constructed commercial freighters. The country had power, but it was sleeping power. Even before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had sensed the coming storm. In December 1940, he described the United States as the arsenal of democracy. At the time, Britain stood nearly alone against Nazi Germany. Through the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, America began supplying weapons and materials to Allied nations without formally entering the war. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, food, fuel, all flowing across the Atlantic. Still, few could imagine the scale that was coming. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States military was not fully prepared for global war. The Army ranked 17th in the world in size. Aircraft production lagged behind Germany's. The Navy was powerful, but it had just lost or damaged 8 battleships in a single morning. The question hung in the air: could America build fast enough? Within weeks, something extraordinary began to happen. Civilian automobile production was scheduled to stop entirely by early 1942. Detroit, the Motor City, shifted gears. Instead of chrome trim and leather seats, assembly lines were retooled for armored hulls and aircraft engines. The massive River Rouge complex, the Ford Motor Company began preparing for something unprecedented. Under government contract, Ford would build B-24 Liberator bombers at a new facility called Willow Run in Michigan. The B-24 was a 4-engine heavy bomber, complex, massive, demanding precision engineering. Meanwhile, General Motors converted plants to produce aircraft engines, machine guns, and tanks. Chrysler constructed the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, which would build M4 Sherman tanks by the thousands. Factories ran 24 hours a day. 3 shifts. Lights burning through the night. The transformation was not smooth. Early production faced bottlenecks. Skilled workers were scarce. Blueprints designed for handcrafted production had to be adapted for mass assembly. A bomber is not a car. A tank transmission is not a sedan gearbox. Engineering teams rewrote processes under immense pressure. Meanwhile, in Washington, the War Production Board was established in January 1942 to coordinate industrial output. It decided who received steel, rubber, aluminum. It rationed materials. It forced cooperation between rival corporations. In peacetime, these companies competed fiercely. Now they shared designs, tooling methods, even factory space. On the West Coast, shipyards began constructing Liberty ships, cargo vessels designed for speed of production rather than elegance. Welders replaced traditional riveters. Prefabricated sections were assembled like industrial building blocks. At first, it took more than 200 days to build one Liberty ship. Within 2 years, some yards could complete one in less than a week. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, The first B-24s rolled off Willow Run slowly, then faster. By 1944, the plant would produce one bomber per hour at peak efficiency. The scale was staggering: miles of conveyor belts, tens of thousands of workers, engines lowered into place by cranes swinging above polished concrete floors, and the workforce itself was changing as millions of American men joined the armed forces. Labor shortages grew. Women stepped forward in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, but behind the posters were real welders, machinists, and inspectors. Women worked drill presses. They installed wiring harnesses. They learned to read blueprints. African American workers, long excluded from many industrial jobs, began entering defense plants in larger numbers after Executive Order 8802 banned racial discrimination in defense industries. The changes were imperfect and often contested, but they were real. By 1943, the United States economy had fully mobilized. Automobile production for civilians was zero. Not reduced, zero. The last civilian car rolled off assembly lines in February 1942. After that, it was tanks, trucks, aircraft, guns. Production numbers climbed at a pace that stunned foreign observers. In 1941, the United States produced around 6,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number exceeded 96,000 in a single year. Shipyards launched thousands of vessels, destroyers, escort carriers, cargo ships, but production was not just about quantity. It was about reliability, standardization, interchangeable parts. The American system of mass production, refined since the early 20th century, now focused entirely on war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German industry faced Allied bombing, resource shortages, and political interference. In Japan, limited access to oil and raw materials constrained output. The Axis powers fought fiercely, but they could not match the sustained industrial surge building across American states. Still, in early 1942, victory was far from certain. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at alarming rates along the U.S. East Coast. In the Pacific, Japanese forces captured territory rapidly. American troops were fighting desperately in places like Bataan and Guadalcanal. Factories could produce weapons, but could they produce them fast enough to matter? In shipyards, sparks flew against dark steel hulls. In aircraft plants, rivet guns hammered like mechanical rain. In tank factories, engines roared to life for the first time before being shut down and crated for shipment overseas. Each machine carried hope. Each machine carried pressure. By late 1942, the first signs appeared. Convoys were better protected. Aircraft numbers increased. Tanks rolled off ships onto foreign shores. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan. It was steel and aluminum and sweat, and yet, as the war intensified in Europe and the Pacific, an even greater surge was coming, one that would tip the balance in ways few could yet imagine. The question was no longer whether America could build. It was how overwhelming that building would become. By 1943, the noise inside American factories had become a constant, living thing. Steel presses slammed down with bone-shaking force. Rivet guns snapped like rapid gunfire. Overhead cranes glided across ceilings, carrying fuselages that seemed impossibly large. The smell of hot metal, machine oil, and fresh-cut aluminum filled the air. Workers moved in practice rhythm, tight turns, steady hands, focused eyes. The United States was no longer preparing for industrial war. It was dominating. Willow Run in Michigan, the Ford Motor Company plant stretched nearly a mile in length. It was one of the largest factories under a single roof in the world. Inside, B-24 Liberators advanced down the assembly line in carefully timed stages. Nose sections fitted here, wings attached there, engines mounted in synchronized precision. At peak production in 1944, the plant completed one bomber every hour. 1 every hour. The B-24 would become the most produced heavy bomber in history, over 18,000 built during the war. Crews would fly them over Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. But those crews depended on something thousands of miles away: riveters in Michigan, machinists in Ohio, inspectors in California. Meanwhile, the Chrysler Detroit Arsenal tank plant was turning out M4 Sherman tanks at staggering speed. Designed for mass production, the Sherman was not the most heavily armored tank of the war. But it was reliable, mechanically straightforward, easy to transport, and most importantly, available in huge numbers. By 1944, American factories had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. They would fight in North Africa, roll through Italy, and land on the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. Quantity became a strategic weapon. But it wasn't just tanks and bombers. The scale extended everywhere. Shipyards on the West Coast and along the Gulf of Mexico launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. In 1943 alone, the United States built more than 2,700 Liberty ships. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, became famous for record construction times. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in just over 4 days as a demonstration of peak efficiency. 4 days. ATC. Those ships carried food, fuel, ammunition, trucks, and aircraft to Allied forces. Without them, no invasion could happen. No sustained campaign could survive. Meanwhile, American aircraft production reached levels that defied imagination. In 1944, the United States produced nearly 96,000 military aircraft, fighters like the P-51 Mustang, heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, naval aircraft for carriers across the Pacific. For comparison, Germany's peak annual aircraft production never reached that number in a single year. In sheer output, the gap widened month by month, and yet, it wasn't effortless. Factories struggled with labor shortages as over 16 million Americans served in uniform. Women made up nearly 37% of the industrial workforce by 1945. They worked long shifts, often 6 or 7 days a week. Many had never worked industrial jobs before the war. Training programs were accelerated. Mistakes happened. Accidents happened. But production rarely stopped. African American workers, though still facing segregation and discrimination, found new opportunities in defense plants. Migration from the rural South to industrial cities accelerated. The war reshaped the American labor landscape permanently. Meanwhile, innovation surged alongside output. At T. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, engineers tested weapons relentlessly, firing thousands of rounds, pushing engines until they failed, measuring armor thickness against enemy shells. Problems discovered in the field were reported back to factories. Adjustments were made. Designs refined. Feedback loops shortened. In laboratories, quieter revolutions unfolded. The Manhattan Project, one of the most secret industrial scientific efforts in history, mobilized over 130,000 workers across sites like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Entire towns were built in secrecy. Massive facilities enriched uranium and produced plutonium. Most workers did not even know what they were building. Industrial capacity had expanded into something almost unimaginable. Back in Europe, Allied bombing campaigns intensified in 1943 and 1944. Waves of American bombers flew deep into German territory, targeting factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. Those bombers required continuous replacement. Losses were heavy. But replacement aircraft kept arriving. Could Germany replace its losses at the same pace? Increasingly, it could not. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers became floating airfields. American shipyards produced Essex-class fleet carriers at remarkable speed. Each required tens of thousands of tons of steel, miles of wiring, advanced radar systems. By war's end, the United States had built 24 Essex-class carriers, far more than any other nation's fleet carriers during the conflict. Industrial math began to dictate battlefield outcomes. When American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, they did so with overwhelming logistical support. More than 150,000 troops crossed the English Channel on the first day alone. Behind them came trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery, fuel pipelines, prefabricated harbors known as mulberries. None of it existed without factories, and still the output climbed. By the end of the war, the United States had produced approximately 300,000 aircraft, over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 2 million trucks. The humble 2.5-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, became one of the most important vehicles of the war, moving supplies across Europe's muddy roads, even something as small as a rifle mattered. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic and reliable, was produced in the millions. Ammunition plants ran non-stop, churning out billions of rounds. Billions. At times, the numbers seem abstract, too large to grasp. But on a battlefield in France, when a unit needed ammunition and it arrived on time, that number became survival. In the Pacific, when a damaged carrier was repaired and returned to service within months, that number became momentum, yet industrial dominance created its own pressure. Logistics had to match production. Railroads strained under constant movement of materials. Coal mines increased output. Oil refineries operated at maximum capacity. Rationing at home ensured that civilians conserved rubber, gasoline, meat, sugar. The entire society was involved, and somewhere inside that vast machine, an unspoken realization grew. The war was becoming a contest not just of courage or tactics, but of endurance and output. Could any nation match this scale for long? By late 1944, Germany's cities lay under heavy bombardment. Japan's industrial centers were increasingly targeted. Meanwhile, American factories, protected by oceans, remained largely untouched. The imbalance widened, but as 1945 approached, a final question lingered: if industry had built the weapons that pushed the Axis back to its last strongholds, what would those final weapons mean for the world that came after? August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima, Japan. A blinding flash tears across the morning sky. For a fraction of a second, shadows burn into concrete. Windows shatter inward. A column of smoke rises where a city stood. The aircraft that delivered the bomb, a B-29 Superfortress, had taken off from Tinian Island hours earlier. Its engines, its aluminum skin, its instruments, its bomb bay mechanisms, all products of American factories. The industrial surge that began in panic after Pearl Harbor had reached its most terrifying conclusion. The B-29 itself was one of the most complex engineering projects of the war. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, advanced fire control systems. Built at enormous cost, over $3 billion in wartime dollars, it required vast networks of subcontractors across the United States. Aluminum from the Pacific Northwest. Engines from plants in the Midwest. Precision instruments assembled in specialized facilities. It represented the peak of wartime industrial capability, and it carried a weapon born from the Manhattan Project, an industrial and scientific enterprise so vast it consumed entire regions. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, massive electromagnetic separators enriched uranium inside buildings that stretched for acres. At Hanford, Washington, nuclear reactors produced plutonium in remote desert complexes. At Los Alamos, New Mexico, scientists and engineers assembled the final devices under intense secrecy. More than 130,000 people worked on the project. Most never knew its full purpose. Industry had fused with science. The result ended the war in the Pacific within days of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. The most destructive war in human history was over, but even before the atomic bombs, American industrial power had already reshaped the battlefield beyond recovery for the Axis. By 1945, the United States had produced approximately 297,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced around 119,000. Japan, about 76,000. The disparity was not just numerical, it was compounding. When American bombers were shot down over Europe, replacements arrived within weeks. When German factories were destroyed, they struggled to rebuild under constant attack. In shipbuilding, The numbers were even more staggering. The United States launched over 5,000 merchant ships during the war. Liberty and Victory ships crossed oceans in endless convoys. Escort carriers, destroyers, battleships, submarines, all constructed in quantities that dwarfed pre-war expectations to T1 point in 1943 and 1944. American shipyards were launching more tonnage annually than all Axis powers combined. Meanwhile, on land, over 2 million trucks rolled off American assembly lines. The 2.5-ton truck became the backbone of Allied mobility in Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later identified the truck, along with the Jeep, the C-47 transport aircraft, and the bulldozer, as one of the most vital tools of Allied victory. Mobility meant speed. Speed meant pressure. When Allied forces broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, they advanced rapidly across France. The Red Ball Express, an enormous truck convoy system, kept fuel and ammunition flowing forward. Without that industrial base, the advance would have stalled. And then there was oil. American refineries processed vast quantities of petroleum, supplying not only US forces but also Allied nations. Fuel-powered bombers, tanks, ships. In contrast, Germany faced severe oil shortages, especially after Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants. By late 1944, many German units were immobilized not by lack of weapons, but by lack of fuel. Industry had become strategy, yet the transformation did not happen without cost at home. Ration books limited sugar, gasoline, meat. Scrap metal drives collected household pots and pans. War bonds financed production. Families hung service flags in windows, blue stars for sons serving, gold stars for those lost. Factories were loud, relentless, exhausting, but they were also places of pride. Workers signed their names inside fuselages. Riveters posed beside finished bombers. Photographs captured rows of women in coveralls beneath the wings of aircraft that would cross oceans. For many, the work was personal. Brothers were fighting overseas. Sons were in uniform. The machine they tightened might save a life. Or End1.BY September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials formally signed the instrument of surrender. The ship itself, a massive Iowa-class battleship, was another product of American industry, constructed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The war had begun for the United States with burning ships at Pearl Harbor. It ended aboard a ship built in American steel mills. When historians analyze the conflict, they debate tactics, leadership, intelligence. But one fact remains clear: industrial capacity defined the limits of possibility. It determined how long armies could fight, how far they could travel, how often they could replace losses. In 1941, the United States accounted for roughly 40% of the world's industrial output. By 1945, it produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. Its homeland remained largely untouched by bombing. Its factories expanded even as others were reduced to rubble. The scale altered global power permanently. After the war, many factories transitioned back to civilian production. Automobile assembly resumed. Refrigerators replaced rifles on conveyor belts. Suburban neighborhoods expanded. The GI Bill sent veterans to college. The wartime industrial surge laid the foundation for decades of economic dominance. But it also left a new reality. The same industrial and scientific power that built tanks and bombers had built atomic weapons. The world entered the nuclear age. Factories that once turned out Shermans and B-24s would soon produce jet aircraft, intercontinental missiles, submarines armed with weapons of unimaginable force. The arsenal of democracy had proven its strength. The question now was how that strength would be used. When we look back at the smoke over Pearl Harbor, at the roar of assembly lines in Detroit, at Liberty ships sliding into grey water, we see more than machines. We see a nation that converted fear into production, production into momentum, and momentum into victory. But beneath the numbers, 300,000 aircraft, thousands of ships, millions of vehicles, were individual hands. Calloused, grease-stained, steady, ordinary people. Their work reshaped the outcome of World War II. It reshaped geopolitics. It reshaped technology. It reshaped the modern world we live in today, and maybe that is the final realization. Wars are fought on battlefields, but sometimes they are won on factory floors. When you think about World War II, do you picture soldiers or the assembly lines behind them?